go ahead and call the meeting to order. We do have a quorum, so this fine day of the 16th of September, Sherwood Police Advisory Board meeting is called to order. We'll go ahead and do a roll call, if we will, Angie.
All right. Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Chair Dorsey. Hi. Chair Dorsey.
Present.
Vice Chair Thornton. Here. Diane Foster. Here. Mike Meyer.
Here.
Marie Shaw is not here right now. Mike Schultz.
Here.
And Mike Smith is absent tonight. Chris West.
Here.
And Lori Zwingli. Here. All right, great. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Approval of the minutes. The meeting minutes went out in your email. Did everyone have a chance to look over them? Are there any amendments to those meeting minutes, or do I hear a motion?
I move that the meeting minutes are approved.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
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 All opposed, same sign? Okay, so be it. The meeting minutes will be approved as written. Great. And now, board member announcements. I will start. Let's start with one of our newest members, Mike Schmidt. I mean, Mike. Yeah. Hey. Are you on?
Which Mike? Mike Schultz?
Mike Schultz.
I don't have anything new to announce. Just got back from, I was down at that Cougar Peak fire in Lakeview for the last week. So I just got back from that last night at 7:30. So I looked over the minutes today and made sure that I was ready for this meeting, but I haven't done a lot the last couple of weeks. I've been working a lot. So that's all I got.
We appreciate that sincerely.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. All right, moving on. Let's jump to Megan. Do you have anything for us tonight?
Just gratitude that the first week of school went well and very uneventful, but they had the SPD there in case it wasn't uneventful.
I've got a glitch going on here, so I apologize.
I just said I was really thankful that the first week of school went as the first week of school should go, and that the SPD was prepared if it didn't go that way, but that it did. So the mama bear in me is satisfied and very happy.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Diane Foster.
I would just echo Megan's comments, but most also that I saw a lot of Sherwood PD cars around at the various schools, which was really nice to see. And, you know, it just always feels a little nicer and calmer when that's the case. So I really appreciate that.
I apologize. My computer is acting up here. Okay. Next, Chris.
All right. I'm calling in from sunny California, Southern California, Ventura County. I'm down here at my folks. We'll be returning on Saturday. Got to go to the beach a bit. Got to go to Santa Barbara Zoo today. So that's been fun. My announcement is I was coming home from North Wilsonville on August 31st around 4 o'clock, and I had a young, aggressive driver pass me on Day Road as I'm heading towards Graham's Ferry. And, you know, it's busy traffic time, and he didn't get ahead of me. You know, he didn't get it past another car, and with the new bypass, I was behind him in the left lane, turning onto Tonkin. So I turned on my cell phone video, which was on a magnetic mount. As we turned left onto Tonkin, he blew by the car that was in front of him. And I got it on videotape. So the next morning, I sent the clip to Captain Carlson. It had the driver's license, or I mean the license plate on it, and I had a little exchange, an email with Captain Carlson. I understood that they really couldn't do anything. It was outside of the city, couldn't see because of tinted windows, and I didn't see exactly anything more than a young male driving the car. But Captain turned it over to one of the officers who did a little homework, and it happened to be a Sherwood resident. And the officer went by and had a little discussion with the 21-year-old's mom, showed her the video, and left his card there to have a return call if the young man wanted to talk to the officer. But it was interesting. I did a little bit of a Facebook post about it carefully on the Sherwood community page. And two things. One, that our Sherwood PD has the ability to go and do that kind of follow-up, just some education, hopefully changing behavior. And one of the persons that commented to me on Facebook offline happens to be a detective at Lake Oswego who lives in our community. And he said he wished during his career that he'd worked for a PD that had the opportunity to do that kind of policing and follow-up. So I just, I think it shows how our department can address challenges and do some good, important follow-up. And I just want to say a good job to Captain Carlson and Officer Kesey for taking the time and doing that. Hopefully it made an impression on the young man to drive a little more within the lines. So that's what I have to share, Brian.
Wonderful. Yeah, that is a great benefit of having such a proactive police presence and community here in Sherwood, for sure. Let's go to Mike Meyer. How are you today, Mike?
Good. How you doing, Brian? I've been out of town actually, not working. We were in Orlando, Florida for my son's 16th birthday this entire last week. And something I thought about there, it's unbelievable the lack of policemen on some of the interstates there. I found myself in our rental car trying to keep up with traffic and looking down and noticing I was doing almost 80 miles an hour, and I was getting passed like I was standing still. Traffic's commonplace for them to be going over 100 miles an hour. It was unbelievable. And even the truckers, the semis, very aggressive. Just saw it constantly on the highways there, and I was blown away. And I was stationed in Southern California for a long time, so I've seen some pretty bad driving, but this was in the Orlando area. It was quite amazing. But we're home now, safe, and it's not 95 and 90% humidity here, so glad to be back in Sherwood.
Brian, are you muted?
Muted.
Oh, I apologize. I was muted. I had an interruption with my internet, so I had to switch to a different method. Bree? Can you hear me?
I'll remember to unmute myself. No major updates. I did turn in my traffic thing, and I haven't been hit in the crosswalk, so I haven't had any close calls in the last month, so that's good. The only thing I was going to mention is I will be out of town next in the October meeting. We're going to Disneyland, so we'll be gone. I'll be thinking of you all, but I'll be in Anaheim.
Not a problem. Well, let us go on then to, I'll jump in real quick. I know Mike Smith is out. I just want to speak before Lori spoke. I first of all want to acknowledge the amazing officers that were represented this week at the schools. There was a plan in place. It worked effectively. Chief, you should be very proud of your men and women in blue. They did a wonderful job making the kids feel safe and comfortable. The parents complimented them on it. I heard numerous compliments on it. It wasn't an overwhelming type of force. It was just a support for those that were going back to school this week, and it was phenomenal. I didn't hear of anything happening. You may be able to speak to that more effectively, but they did a wonderful job in the eyes of all of the citizens here. So that's a great compliment to you and your team. Also, during this time of COVID, I know there's a lot of families that have been personally impacted, but some of the folks that we don't often think of being impacted by what's happening and the illnesses that are being contracted are our officers. And they do have family members. They are human, and they have been impacted, some of them in very impactful ways, their family members and what have you. So it is such a testament to have the Sherwood Police Foundation, and I've asked Lori just to touch on it a little bit of what they're doing to help to support our police as they are dealing with the sicknesses in their own families and how that may be impacting them and what we're doing to support them and help them. Lori, would you like to speak next?
Sure. And thank you for that little segue there. I appreciate it. We do have, as many of you know, the Sherwood Police Foundation is here to help support the Sherwood Police Department and to help strengthen and promote the relationship between the community and the department members. And so when we heard that there were some department members whose families were being significantly impacted during this time, we set up a system so that the officers can approach the chief and let him know that there may be a need, and the chief will come to us and let us know about that need, and then we can supply some funds to help the officers meet the needs for their families, whether it's to buy them plane tickets to go somewhere or to just help support the family in general. That's something that we've been able to do. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to support them in that way. And we hope that, that they understand that they can continue to come to us if they need those forms of help. I did have a comment too that was more directly related to the PAB and what we do here. As far as the new high school, I have been getting a lot of feedback from people who live on the side of Sunset in the corner there by Middleton Elementary School. I don't know if you have all seen on the community page the traffic issue that has developed because of the new high school, but the people within that section of the Woodhaven development are also feeling it in that when they used to be able to come out Brookman and go up and to the right, and they turn and they take their left back down to 99 if they had to go down the Newburgh way. And now they're finding that it's very difficult to be able to do that because of all the traffic from the school. So they're having to back out. If anybody wants to go left, they're having to back out, come up by the YMCA and take their left up there, which I guess they didn't used to have to do. I don't live over there. So, but this is what I'm being told. And they'd like to be able to present these issues to someone. One woman submitted it to the Traffic Safety Committee and was told that it needs to go to ODOT instead. So I'd like some clarification so that I can tell people, where do you need to present the issues that you see developing from the traffic conditions that are popping up because of the location of the new high school? Who do we talk to about that so that we can try to get something done? I mean, the one suggestion that I had was that maybe we could put a light there at Brookman and 99 so that people can take a left, which would not only allow them to bypass the intersection up there at the Y, but also would maybe help slow people down before they hit that intersection so that we didn't have as many people running lights and causing accidents, etc.
Do we know why that changed? Because I live in Woodhaven. I know exactly what y'all are talking about. It's a pain in the rear to go anywhere from 7:40 a.m. until 8:30. I don't leave my house because I can't go anywhere. I'm stuck. I can't go left, right, straight. So do we know why ODOT or whoever changed that Brookman to not be able to go straight across and then take a left down 99 up to Newburgh? Was the amount of accidents they had there?
Well, and to clarify, are we talking like Middleton to Old 99W to Brookman and out that way compared to Sunset and out?
Yes.
Because now
Okay.
you have to go to Sunset. If you want to go to Newburgh from where we are in Woodhaven, we used to be able to go kind of over by Middleton
Right.
down and then go across and play chicken with the oncoming traffic. And now you can't. So everybody has to go in that left-hand lane, and it's caused so much backup in the morning and at night. Like at night, you can't go down between 4:30-ish until about 5:30. It's
Yeah,
kind of worthless to go down Sunset.
I live in Woodhaven too. I just wasn't sure if Brookman was still entirely closed or not. Thank you for clarifying that, Marie.
Okay, so there's a couple of things at play. First of all, the Brookman and 99W intersection is completely unrelated to the high school construction and the high school traffic and the construction that took place at Sunset and 99W. So that Brookman work is related to the expansion of Brookman and some of the annexations and some of the work being done there. It is an ODOT project because it's 99W and it involves an intersection at 99W. And so that's, I'm not in a position to tell you exactly what's going to be done because I just don't remember. So that problem, that situation was going to exist and would have existed independently of anything else that's going on. So that's just a separate project. So that's the best I can tell you about that. So with regard to getting information about that, people should contact the city to get clarification about what's happening. So engineering department, and find out, what's the plan there? What exactly is happening? When is it going to be done? All those questions. And then if they have feedback about that project, then ultimately, yeah, that goes to ODOT because that's their baby. So now what is happening, I can tell you, related to the high school, is that there's more people that are trying to go out Brookman. And so that's causing an increase in the amount of traffic that is now taking that route. And they're doing that because they're trying to avoid the intersection with Sunset and 99W, because that intersection has become extremely busy with the opening of the new high school. So I appreciate all the good feedback about our presence at the high school for the first, and the other schools for the first couple days. And it from our perspective, it went off without a hitch. But I can tell you now, though, that we are running around like crazy trying to manage a myriad of traffic issues and concerns related to school traffic, many of which are related to what's going on at the high school, but then also now the old high school, which is the middle school, is also seeing a tremendous increase in traffic, at least so far. Now, whether that levels out or not, I don't know. But because it's a middle school now, there appears to be a lot more parent drop-offs. And so, excuse me, we're seeing a lot of traffic backup on Meineke Road there in front of Sherwood Middle School. We're seeing...
It would be great if you could have traffic patrol come out again to between Pinehurst and where the high school cul-de-sac is at the end of like Woodhaven and Saunders, because
they're out there every day. We literally cannot. They're out there every day, working school zones, working these traffic congested areas, and I'm telling you, that's why I'm letting you know. I was going to cover this in the staff report, but we'll just cover it now. If we're fortunate enough to have 4 people out on day shift, they are going to be completely overwhelmed by the number of issues that we're experiencing. So I appreciate your suggestion, but they're going to hit randomly and go wherever they can go and deal with whatever challenges they're going to deal with. What they're not going to be able to do is direct traffic. They're not going to be able to get into certain areas and say, okay, well, we'll get out and help traffic. They just can't do that because they can't. There's too many areas where they could try to do that. So we're also having a lot of backups that are associated with parent drop-offs and student drivers at the high school. So the good news is that the city is working with the school district very closely, and this is all, of course, new with the opening of the school. And so we're going to be working on the days and weeks ahead to identify solutions and different things we can do to try to alleviate this. So understand the frustrations. And I would just say if people want to share specific concerns, they can email us at the police department, they can email the city, and odds are we already know about it, but it's still okay to let us know just to make sure. So the city and the school district and the police department is trying to do everything they possibly can to try to alleviate some of these and excuse me, make them go away. And then just a very, very quick, nice reminder for everybody. Please don't use the chat feature. I see some comments back and forth. In a public meeting, we cannot use the chat feature because it doesn't create the public record that we need it to. So just a reminder, everybody, for that. So anyway, hopefully that answers the question about the traffic and what's going on with that.
Thank you so much, Chief. And two birds with one stone. So that was a great introduction there. So up next on the agenda of the area of business, we have the pleasure of having with us Kevin Barton, who is both a resident but also serves on the Washington County DA as a Washington County DA, and he's going to be talking to us about use of force. And so I'll let him introduce himself, but it's a very pertinent and timely topic. And so I'm excited to see what he has to share.
So I'm actually, Mr. Chair, and Kevin, forgive me, I'm going to jump in real quick. Just as a reminder, we've got some new members. We have had ongoing conversations over the last several months talking about use of force, getting feedback from community members on just very generally what their expectations might be. We've talked about mental health crisis and how we respond to those. And so as well as we've discussed policies regarding use of force. And so I just thought this would be the right time to have our district attorney come in and talk about use of force from his perspective. And so keep in mind that we're talking about when very significant things happen, right? Then the district attorney steps in with the major crimes team, and he's going to tell you all about that. But I thought it would be very informative for this board to know kind of what happens when a significant use of force occurs. So with that introduction, Kevin, you're up. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chief. And Brian, thank you. Good to see you all. Thanks for having me. Before I get any further, I want to just make sure I use the amount of time that you would like me to use. So how much time do we have for this? And I want to reserve plenty of time for questions as well.
Well, you are the main topic for the meeting.
Okay, so I'm thinking a couple hours. What do you guys think? Is that good?
Sounds good.
All right. Well, tell you what, I want to make this as useful and interactive as we can, given the format that we have. I think what I'll do is I'll start just by telling you a little bit about me so you know who's talking with you. I have a PowerPoint slide prepared, but that's really just to give us a launching pad to have this conversation. So in a minute, I'll share my screen and we can go through that. And then on that slide, I was going to just give a general overview of the office, and then I was going to focus in on some use of force issues and have that conversation. So let me start first just by saying I'm sitting in Sherwood right now, and I've been to a lot of these different meetings throughout the county and lots of different cities. but I actually find the one in my own city the most interesting because I was sitting in traffic this morning dropping my son off at Sherwood Middle School, the old Sherwood High School, and I'm across the street now from the new Sherwood High School, and there's traffic there every morning and every night. So I feel your pain because I'm right there with you. So a little bit about me, and why don't I go ahead and share my screen? So hang on a second as I shift to doing that. Let's see. You should all be seeing my screen right now. And is that right? Can someone just let me know? Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so first thing is, our DA's office, we have a mission statement, which is seeking justice and protecting our community. And really what that means is doing the right thing for the right reason. That's the seeking justice part. And the protecting our community is being mindful that every decision we make is with public safety in mind. At the end of the day, when you take away everything else, one of the main functions of the DA is to help ensure that our public safety system works and that you're safe, and that you feel safe and you are safe, and that we stop crime from happening. We hold people accountable who commit crime. We help victims who are victimized by crime. We have a website and we have all the usual social media channels. Feel free to Google us or to look on that website. And we've tried to do a really good job of putting on our website everything that we're up to. So if there's a case we've handled, we usually put that on there. If there's an initiative we're working on, we put that on there as well. So here's our mission statement once again. Who and what is the DA? I want to just kind of give you some basic facts about what the DA role is. So it's an elected position every 4 years. So, I'm employed essentially by the 600,000+ citizens of Washington County. The DA is not accountable to the county government or city government or even state government. It's directly accountable to the people. And that's important to have that independent district attorney role, I think, in every county. There's 36 counties and there are 36 DAs for that reason. The main duty of a DA is to prosecute crimes, state law crimes that happen in any given county. So here in Washington County, and of course I work alongside the sheriff and all the chiefs of police. Chief Groth and I are in countless meetings with each other and in regular contact as different issues come up. It's a nonpartisan position too. So although it's an elected position, you don't run as a Republican or a Democrat. You just run as a district attorney candidate. And that, of course, is because those types of party politics don't really belong in a DA's office. This slide just has a lot of information on it, but I really like the way it describes the role and the duty of the district attorney. So I got it from Oregon's Blue Book, which, if you don't know, is sort of like a fact book about the state. You can Google this and find it as well. I'm not going to read it to you because you can read it on your screen, but essentially it talks about what we expect district attorneys to do and how there's a role in making sure that the DA is fair, that the DA protects victims and seeks justice, holds people accountable, and then that elected accountability aspect that I mentioned as well. So that's just a little bit of background about the role of the actual district attorney. The office itself is large. So we're the second largest office in the state. The largest DA's office is in Multnomah County. And we've got over 130 people. We serve roughly 12,500 crime victims every year, and that's people in our community. So your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, your family members. We have almost 12,000 cases a year that come in the front door to us. And so what'll happen is, let's say there's a crime in Sherwood. Let's say that driver that was mentioned earlier crashed into someone and committed a reckless driving crime or committed a hit and run crime, and they're in the city. Well, one of Chief Groth's officers would either make an arrest or write up a report and would send that to our office. And then our deputy DAs, our prosecutors, and there's some pictures of them on the screen in front of you here, they'll go through and review the facts, the evidence that the police officers have gathered. And the way I've always explained this to people is, if you think of a relay race where you've got that baton that gets handled from one runner to the next, the police, they run the first lap around the route where they do the investigation, and then they hand that case to us, and then we run the next lap where we handle it in court. So that's how we work together, but we have separate roles. You can see some of the other stats that are on the screen in front of you, just to give you an idea by the numbers, kind of what we do. So we don't file charges in every case. We file charges in roughly 9,000 cases every year. So there's a triage and an analysis that goes on where we look to see, is there enough evidence to prove a crime? Do we need to have more work done, or can we go forward now? Can we meet that very high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the high standard we have to meet in court in order to convict someone? And if we can't, then we make the decision not to go forward. So we make that decision on several thousand cases a year, actually, where there's just not enough to go forward. And then we're in court and in trial, like you see on TV. In a typical year, we've got about 300 trials. We've had fewer during the COVID backlog or the COVID restrictions, but we've been in court physically present every day throughout COVID. We never went virtual. We just always had to function, just like the police departments always continue to function. And because we provide that essential service for our community of making sure our justice system continues to operate. And then we do have a little bit of involvement with some money. So if a crime victim, let's say, is owed money for a damage. So for example, if someone's car is stolen and we catch the person who stole the car and there's a deductible to pay, then the person who committed that crime would have to pay the victim that deductible. So the victim is made whole, and we help make sure that that order happens by a judge. Or if a parent is owed child support, we help collect that as well. We work throughout the county. This slide just kind of represents that, every single city has a police department, and we're handling crimes from every single city. We've got within our office a whole bunch of different units. And I put that picture there, not just because I like dogs, but that's actually a therapy dog from CARES Northwest, which is a child abuse clinic that helps out child victims of crimes in Washington County. That dog was out in front of the courthouse during Child Abuse Awareness Month. And that's the Washington County Courthouse. But as you can see, we've got different specialty units that handle different types of cases. And if there were time, I'd be happy to go through more of that. But I'm going to kind of skip ahead so we can get to the in-depth conversation here on use of force. I wanted you to see this slide because, and I know there's a lot of stuff for you on it, but the criminal process is something that a lot of people, they know about mostly from television. In fact, if I were to say to you, you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and I stop talking, my guess is everyone in the room knows how that sentence ends. But most of you, except for Jeff Groth, most of you know that because you've seen it on TV. And the interesting thing about our system is a lot of people are informed by the system based on the television dramas about the system. But there is a little bit of looking behind the curtains to see what happens. So the basic progress of a criminal case is the police handle that initial investigation. They hand it off to us. And then depending on the nature of the crime, it can take a couple different routes, but ultimately it'll either go to a trial or the person who's accused of a crime has a decision to make and he or she can enter what's called a guilty plea. If a person says, hey, I'm innocent, I didn't commit the crime, then their right is to have a trial, and then we have a judge or a jury make the decision. And if they're convicted after a trial, or if they decide to plead guilty of the crime that they've been accused of, then there's a sentencing proceeding where a judge decides what the sentence should be. And then at the end of the day, that sentence can include lots of different options. It can be, time spent behind bars, in jail or in prison. It can also be a treatment program or supervision. So there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that go into play. When we're talking about sentencing, this is a grid that is used, and I can go back at the end of our presentation if people have questions about this, but again, a lot of information I know, but I wanted to kind of explain to you how sentencing decisions can work. So every crime in Oregon is ranked with a seriousness level. So 1 is the least serious, 11 is the most serious. So depending on the seriousness of the crime on the left-hand side of that grid, and every person is ranked based on their criminal history. So if you've never committed a crime before and been caught, so if you've never been convicted of a crime, you're an I. And if you've committed multiple crimes, you could be somewhere all the way up to A. So it's kind of like playing Battleship if you think of it with a grid. You look at the seriousness of the crime, and then you look at the criminal history of the person, and then a judge will use this grid to help decide what the sentence ought to be. And I won't get into details about what each box means, but basically if it's somewhere in yellow, that means it's presumptively going to prison. And if it's somewhere not in yellow, that means probably not going to prison. So 11I would be 120 to 121 months in prison. Whereas, let's say 1A would be time spent on probation, not going to jail or prison. So I wanted you to have that. Now, the main
Kevin?
reason I'm here, I'm sorry?
I'm not sure if you can see when hands go up with questions or not.
I cannot, I'm sorry. So you know what, why don't I stop? I'll stop sharing my screen for a second because I cannot see hands. Let's see.
Or if you want, you can keep sharing and I can just help you. Whatever
Let's
you
do
like.
that, Jeff. That would be better. So, well, why don't I just pause for a minute and answer questions people have, then I'll go back to Sharon. So go ahead.
Chris.
Yeah, Kevin, could you explain the difference between preliminary and a grand jury? When, you know, because when we've had these high profile use of force cases out there, some the DA has put forward and some have gone to grand jury. So can you explain when you use the two different paths?
Great question, Chris. There's a couple issues there I'm going to address. So the first is procedurally, what are those two different things? And then the second is how does it apply in a use of force case? So preliminary hearing is a hearing in front of a judge at the beginning of a case where a judge acts essentially as a gatekeeper to decide, do we let this case go forward or not? A grand jury is the same type of thing, except instead of it being a hearing in front of a judge, think of it as a hearing in front of a jury of 7 citizens who've been brought in randomly, and a jury decides, do we let this case go forward or not? They both serve the same function, and different states in America actually rely on grand juries or preliminary hearings or both. So remember, we're a nation of 50 different systems, 50 different states. So when you see the national news and you hear about charges being filed in a different state, it doesn't always mean the same thing that it means in Oregon. In Oregon, our law says that if it's a misdemeanor crime, then there's no requirement to have that gatekeeper at the beginning. It can be a deputy DA can make the decision based on the prosecutor reviewing the evidence. They can sign a document called a misdemeanor complaint, and then the case starts. If it's a felony crime, which is a more serious crime, and a felony is defined as anything where the punishment can be a year or more in prison, if it's a felony crime, then there has to be that initial gatekeeper check on the system. Think of it as a check and balance on the system. It's too serious to have just one person make that decision. So before it can go beyond that initial charging stage, either a judge has to say yes or a jury has to say yes. And then in Oregon, it actually allows the DA's office to decide, do you go to the judge or do you go to the jury? Every office in Oregon has a policy so that there's consistency about what types of cases you do what with. So in our office, if it's a case of any seriousness whatsoever, or a complicated case or a case with a number of witnesses, we will take all of those to the grand jury. If it's a relatively straightforward, low-level case, let's say it's a property crime, a theft case with one witness, or a drug case where you have a drug dealer with, let's say, 1 or 2 witnesses, we would take those simple, lower-level cases in front of a judge. So that's the basic distinction. Now, your question asked about use of force, and if I can just pause to answer that question when I get into my discussion about use of force, it might be easier. Okay. Any other questions before I talk about use of force? All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen then, and we'll dive into the use of force conversation here. So hang on. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is there's different types of force. And so I want to just distinguish between things that you might see and hear about in the news. So sometimes at one end of the spectrum, the most significant use of force is use of deadly force. So think of it as a police officer using their firearm. That's the most significant use of force that you might typically hear about in the news. At the other end of the spectrum, it could just be something less significant, but still something we pay attention to. And it could be, let's say, rough handling by a police officer using force, or an officer, let's say, tackling someone because they have to tackle that person in order to stop a more serious crime from happening. So officers are allowed to use force. The question is the force that was used allowable and appropriate for the circumstances? So I'm going to focus my conversation on the most serious type of force, which is the use of deadly or lethal force, and talk with you a little bit about how Oregon law and how our system is structured to ensure that we're holding people accountable when that needs to occur, and that we're properly reviewing these instances to ensure that we're meeting all the standards we ought to meet. So the starting point in this analysis is a law that was passed, coming up now on 14, 15 years ago, and it's called Senate Bill 111. And Senate Bill 111 was passed in 2007, and it essentially was an effort by the legislature back then to say, hold on a minute. We want to make sure that there is a generally consistent way that we're reviewing the police use of deadly force around the state. And the Senate recognized that we've got 36 counties and things look differently in Harney County compared to Multnomah County and everywhere in between. So what the Senate did was they said, we want some general consistency, but we want to allow for individuality. And so it required every county to essentially set up what they called a planning authority, which is a group that comes together, and that group makes sure that every county has a plan, and it's called a use of deadly force, physical force response plan. Washington County has one, Multnomah County has one, Clackamas, so on and so forth. So every county is required to have a plan and a group that monitors how that plan is functioning. And the Senate bill also requires that the planning authority set up these protocols to address the use of deadly force by law enforcement when they're doing their duty. So we're not talking about a police officer off duty. We're talking about a police officer on duty when they can and can't use deadly force, but really more interesting, or more to the point, when they do use the deadly force, how do we follow up on that and make sure that everything was done correctly? So the plans are all required to have things like training policies, deadly force policies. So every police department would have to have a policy in their department about how they use the force that's appropriate in the given circumstances. What happens from the mental health perspective for officers after an incident occurs? What are the light duty requirements that might be in place? What are the investigation standards that are in place for what occurs after the deadly force incident happens? What's the role of the DA in each county when one of these incidents occurs? And how do we collect data about this to make sure that we know what's happening and that we have someone examining that data, or at least it's available to be examined? And the planning authority, this is the group that monitors this for a given county. The sheriff, who's elected, and the district attorney, who's elected, are the co-chairs of that planning authority in every county. So every county has this. Every county has what's called a Senate Bill 111 plan. Not every plan is the same because it's designed to allow for some individuality within the different counties. What I did was I took a snippet from our Senate Bill 111 plan, which is the preamble. The plan itself is, I don't know, 15 to 20 pages long, but I thought that this was a good portion to just show you in a bite-sized segment as we're talking about it. So it starts off by talking about and I highlighted the parts in yellow, that's my highlighting. Starts off by talking about, what police officers are designed to do and how the use of the deadly force by law enforcement is something that matters to the public and to law enforcement, and that the purpose of our plan isn't to set the standards for when the force is to be used, because that's set by Oregon law, but instead it's to provide a framework for a consistent response to an officer's use of deadly force that treats everyone affected by the event fairly and promotes confidence in the criminal justice system. So every county is not allowed to decide when can the police use force. That's set by Oregon law, and we have our legislature and our governor who decide what Oregon law is under our system of government. But every county has the individuality to determine how are we going to address the forest once it happens, how are we going to respond to it, are we going to examine it, and what levels of support are we going to give to the officers who are involved in it, and training as well. So let me see here if I click through here. Now, I thought it might be helpful to have a sample scenario, but before I go through that, I just want to pause and check and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, so this is just something I made up. This is not a real case, but I'll tell you, I get called every time there's an officer use of deadly force. I get a phone call, and so what you're about to hear is taken from real cases, but this is not an actual one that we had. So sample scenario, let's say you've got a victim, a crime victim who calls 911 to report domestic violence, also known as DV in the lingo. So typically patrol officers would respond to the home, and maybe they'd knock on the door. And in this scenario, the officers learned that the victim has some injuries, and let's say it's her husband or her boyfriend. He's the suspect. He refuses to cooperate with the officers when they ask him to step outside and to talk to him. And then at some point in the interaction, the suspect fires a gun at an officer, and then the officer returns fire and injures the suspect. And then, of course, the suspect's now injured, and the officer then takes the suspect into custody. So that's the scenario that we have here. We have an officer using deadly force, which is firing a gun. He has shot the suspect. He has not killed the suspect, but he shot him, and he does that after he's fired upon. So the question is, now what? And what next is our process. So the first thing that would typically happen in a scenario like this is the officers would secure the scene. That means making sure there's no other threats, making sure that the victim is safe, rendering first aid to the person who's been shot, all those things that just have to happen in the moment. Think of it like the Band-Aid addressing the critical incident that's occurring. Then, of course, there's phone calls and radio traffic that occurs, and now we've got more people arriving to the scene, of course, EMTs and other officers. But eventually, the next big and important step is what's called our major crimes team is activated. So Washington County has what's called a major crimes team, and our major crimes team is basically all the best detectives from all the police departments in the county. And they generally respond to two types of cases that happen within the county: a murder somewhere in the county, or an officer use of deadly force, most commonly a shooting. So whenever one of those two things happen, there's what's called a major crimes call out, where every officer gets a paged, or I guess no one gets paged anymore. That dates me. Every officer gets texted, called, and emailed, and they all happen at once because I'm on that as well. So all of your devices just start buzzing. And this is usually between 1 and 5 in the morning, I can tell you based on experience. But everyone gets called out, and then there's a decision: how many officers do we need? And members of the major crimes team assemble. They arrive on scene and they take over the investigation. Now, the important thing to note is, let's say in this example, it's a Sherwood police officer who's involved in the shooting. No officer from the involved agency participates in the investigation of that shooting. So the major crimes team is coming out. They're there to really investigate two things: the original domestic violence incident, because remember, there's a crime that occurred that brought the police to the scene in the first place, and that crime needs to be investigated and, if appropriate, prosecuted. But they're also there to investigate the legality of the officer's use of deadly force. So while the officer is not a suspect in the same way that the person who committed the DV crime is a suspect, the major crimes team is nonetheless investigating the appropriateness and the legality of that officer's decision in that moment to use deadly or lethal force. And so, yes.
I'm sorry, I want to interrupt real quick because I want to make a point for our board that to me, as a police officer, as a police leader, as your chief, is critically important, that I'm very passionate about. If you do your own research, you're going to discover that the far and wide best practice is what Kevin just described, and that is that the involved agency who has the shooter, the officer that fired the shot, is not involved in the investigation. And that best practice is going to be according to operational standard, academic standard. However, in spite of that, you will still see incidents throughout the country, some not very far from where we are today, where agencies will investigate their own. They will have their own detectives come out, and they may be joined by others, but they will take part in and or lead the investigation of an officer-involved shooting that involved one of their own, a member of their own department. I'm not interrupting this to point at anybody or to cast any judgment, but I do want you to know where I stand on that. Because as I said, I'm passionate about this. I think Kevin is passionate about this. There's one right way to do these, in my opinion, and only one right way, and that is to completely remove the involved agency, because the absolute unbiased approach and investigation has to take place. So I'll just leave it at that. Kevin, you can add whatever you want to that, but board, I just wanted you to hear that from me. And then Chris, you have a question on that? Or
yeah, and given that several of the community police departments in the county are small like Sherwood's, and the rule on this situation with domestic violence is you have multiple officers respond for cover. So what happens if Washington County's backing up Sherwood officer and both discharge or whatever? Is there that same rule that the departments that are involved aren't on the major crime team? Is that, because I can think back to years ago when one of the Sherwood officers was helping Tualatin, and I can't remember if he fired, but there was deadly force used, and it went on, the investigation went on for a long time. And I just wondered, when there's multiple responding agencies, does that rule still apply?
Yes, it does, to the extent possible. So, but the short answer is yes. And that's not uncommon to have multiple responding agencies. We deal with that frequently, the scenario that you're describing. We've had officer-involved shootings where we've had multiple agencies. And one blessing that we have in Washington County is that we have lots of agencies. And because of that, we can choose to have an officer from agencies A and B investigate when an incident occurs involving officers from, let's say, C and D. So we're able to accommodate that. Now, there are limits to what we can do, and we have had some situations. There have been a couple instances in my time as a prosecutor where it's been a massive situation, and we couldn't entirely guarantee that no officer from an involved agency took any part. And as I'm sitting here now, I think one of those examples, there's a terrible shooting that happened at Hag Lake about 2 years ago, where we had a number of officers that were from multiple different agencies that were part of a tactical team that were shot on, and multiple officers injured. And it was an all hands on deck situation to go out there. But absent something unusual like that, and certainly the investigating officers would never come from the involved agency.
Thank you.
No, you bet. Now, actually, I'm glad that Jeff raised the point he did, because I think it's an important reminder that what you see on the news in national TV doesn't always apply in Washington County the same way it applies in a different state. So that standard doesn't exist everywhere. It doesn't even exist in Portland. Portland Police investigates their own, so they do not separate it out. Clackamas County Sheriff's Office investigates their own. They do not separate it out. So what I've described for you is a Washington County approach that some other jurisdictions around the nation use, but not everyone. I'm telling you how we do it in Washington County. And that's part of our Senate Bill 111 plan, because remember, it's the plan that we've come up with for how we're going to handle things in our county. So getting back to the scenario here, we've got the major crimes team that comes out, and now they're doing their investigation. And these are, if you watch television shows, it's basically the stuff you see on TV when they come out to a crime scene. So they're going to process the scene. They're going to collect the evidence. There's going to be a forensic analysis, whether it's ballistics with the bullets or DNA if there's blood or whatever that might be. The investigators are going to collect that evidence. They're going to get witness statements from people that saw and heard. So sometimes that means canvassing a neighborhood and knocking on doors. Did you see anything, sir? Did you hear anything, ma'am? They literally will do that. Sometimes it'll mean talking to let's say the domestic violence victim who was there, who would have seen and heard what happened to the person who had been attacking her. It also means taking statements from the involved officers. And remember, I said earlier, the major crimes team is investigating the legitimacy or the legality of their actions. They're not suspects, but they're still being investigated, and that's an important distinction. So the officers have the same rights that you and I have under our United States Constitution. They have a right to say something. They also have a right not to say something. We can't make them answer questions. And in fact, if they're forced to answer questions from an employment perspective, if Jeff were to say to his officers, you must answer this question or you'll lose your job, and then they answer a question, whatever they say, we cannot use in a criminal prosecution. It's off limits. So we have to be very careful when we interview the officers to make sure that we interview them in the appropriate way, have it documented on video camera as we're interviewing them. They'll typically have an attorney with them when they're answering questions, just like anyone in our American system would be entitled to have an attorney with them. But generally speaking, the officers will sit down for an interview and answer questions about what happened, what they saw, what they heard, why they did what they did, etc. And then also, and this is becoming increasingly more common, we will collect and review any video evidence. So body-worn camera evidence, which Sherwood has used for a number of years now, and other police departments around the county are beginning to use more, often is just critically useful as we're examining these cases. And so we'll review the body-worn camera evidence. Now, I'll tell you, body-worn camera is one perspective and one perspective only. It's the same perspective that you and I have right now as we're looking at each other. So you can tell it's not a 180-degree panoramic perspective of what's happening. It's just what you're able to see on camera. Sometimes that can be incredibly useful. Sometimes it can distort things. And sometimes you just wish, oh my goodness, I wish the camera had caught this thing, but it's just off the camera. So body-worn camera is a helpful tool that can aid in painting a picture, but it's not the only paintbrush that we have to paint that picture. We look at all of the evidence as we're painting that picture. I'm going to talk about the process of what happens next in a second, but I'll pause. Any questions? Okay. So let's say now the police have done their investigation and they've collected all the evidence and talked to the witnesses. Now what? And a question you might be asking yourself is, why do these always take so long? You feel like you read about it in the newspaper, it happened on a certain day, and then it just takes weeks and weeks or months and months. Why is that the case? The reality is a lot of the investigation happens at the very beginning. It's going hot and heavy for the first few days and weeks, a lot of stuff happening all at once. And then there's kind of a hurry up and wait. And usually what we're waiting on is additional records and things to make sure we know what we're dealing with. So sometimes that can be, let's say we want to find out more information about the person who was shot. Are there mental health issues there? Are there drug addiction issues there? So we might try and gather some background medical information about that person. Or let's say that that person who was shot, let's say that person has died, then there is always an autopsy that occurs, and there's always toxicology examination that occurs to find out, were they on anything, alcohol or controlled substance or something along those lines. And that usually can take months for that process because there's a backlog at the medical examiner's office and the state police crime lab, which processes all that evidence. So generally speaking, when you see in the news things are taking a while, Usually we're just waiting for those important pieces of information to come to us so we can complete that picture that we're trying to figure out of what happened here. We will never make a decision without having as many pieces of the puzzle as we can to know with as much certainty as possible what happened, because we want to make sure we get that decision correct. Nevertheless, we know the public, there's a desire to have information sooner, and it's frankly, it's a good thing for the public to be involved as an essential check on the system. So generally speaking, we're going to be releasing information to the public about what's happening in some small kind of decision points. So usually there's some type of release close in time after the incident occurred. There was a shooting or there was a use of deadly force at such and such day and on such and such time by police officers from such and such agency. There's no further danger. The Washington County Crimes Team is investigating. Additional details will be released when available. It'll be something short and simple like that to let people know this is what happened. Typically then we'll have a follow-up type of release or a statement within the next 24 to 48 hours with a little bit more details. Officers were responding to a domestic violence incident. During the incident, the suspect fired a weapon at the officers. Officers returned fire. The involved officers are on administrative leave. The investigation is still pending. Something more substantive will typically happen in that next second statement. And then we're waiting. And then our process in Washington County is we make a decision. If we have information and evidence that a crime may have been committed by the officer, so put differently, if we review everything and we conclude that it looks as though there's some evidence that the officer may not have been justified in using that deadly or lethal force, then we will present the case to the grand jury to have the independent panel of 7 citizens who have been called in for jury duty, have them review everything and listen to witnesses and look at all the evidence and go through a process. But we will only do that if there's a reason to do it. So if there's some evidence that the officer's use was not justified, some reason to have a grand jury review it, that's when we go through that door number 1, the grand jury. If we review everything and we decide there's nothing here to show that the officer's use of deadly force was not justified, no evidence that the officer may have committed a crime in using that force, then what we'll do is we'll summarize the entire investigation in a written document, a letter. We'll release that letter publicly along with all of the investigation, all of the police reports, all of the body-worn cameras, just everything, open sunlight on everything, with the only exceptions being things like social security numbers or, personal information that needs to be private, of course. Autopsy photos don't get released publicly. We'll have to make some redactions on things to protect privacy, but otherwise the substance of the investigation is released for anyone that wants to look at it. And we routinely have reporters from the Oregonian that come in and look through everything. In fact, tomorrow, a reporter from the Oregonian is going to come in and review police reports from a shooting that occurred in Tigard earlier this year. So it's a routine thing to have that check from the public reviewing it.
Kevin, you have a question from Megan.
Okay, yes, Megan, please.
So this is just a clarification of terms from my understanding, but when you say an officer is on administrative leave, is that like full pay, full benefits? They're basically on vacation, just not at work? Or does that mean?
I'll give you my answer. I'll let Jeff give you his, because that's really a function of the employer, which is the police department. So yeah, they're on leave, meaning it's full pay and benefits. They're not on vacation because, what we haven't talked about is these incidents are traumatic for everyone involved, and there's a trauma for the officers. No police officer wants to shoot anyone. And I'll tell you from talking to those who have, it's a life and career changing thing to have happen. So I just want to emphasize that. But they are on leave during the initial part as we're trying to figure out what happened so that we can get a better sense on when they can return to duty. And I'll turn it over to Jeff if he wants to add anything.
Well, and can you add in, like, is there a counselor or something that intervenes and helps them immediately?
I'll let Jeff answer all that.
Yeah, so number one, it's important to understand that according to Senate Bill 111, the administrative leave is required. So it's actually part of law. And as Kevin said, they are, it's not a vacation. They're subject to recall and call at any point. They generally have to check in at least once a day. And the other part is required by law and is contained in Senate Bill 111 is that they are required, and this answers your second part of your question, they are required, or the agency is required to offer mental health or consultations with a mental health professional at our expense. So yeah, that part is covered. And we can't put them on administrative leave without pay because it's illegal, because we have no basis that they've done anything wrong. So in any disciplinary case, if we have serious allegations and we put somebody on administrative leave, it's always going to be with pay because they have that legal right. And the only time you may see that switch is if an officer becomes indicted by a grand jury. Once they're under indictment, sometimes the leave will be switched to unpaid leave. But the risk to unpaid leave is always when the matter concludes, if the officer is found not guilty or otherwise exonerated, we have to give them all their back pay. So it really becomes a matter of legal right as to the status of the leave. And then
That's
Brian.
fine. It wasn't a judgment. It was just trying to understand the terminology and how it all worked. So
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate both of those.
Brian, question.
Yes. So the information available online as well, or just at the county? I know sometimes you have to go to the county to gather a certain piece of information, but is there a place online where people can go to get factual information direct from the county?
Actually, Brian, I'm really glad you asked that question. We're working on that right now. So I mentioned earlier that there's an Oregonian reporter coming to my office tomorrow. There was a shooting, an officer-involved shooting, use of deadly force that occurred in Tigard in January of this year. That case was just resolved, and that case was handled a little bit differently than the process I've described for you here, but essentially that case was resolved. No charges filed against the officer. And what we're trying to do for the first time is to upload the police reports onto, it's not Google Cloud, but it's like a cloud-based system, to upload it there so that you don't physically have to come to the courthouse where the DA's office is. So we're working on that now. We're not sure if we're going to be able to make that work or not. Usually government technology is lagging behind the rest of us. But at a minimum, it will be available physically for the public to inspect.
All right, and I have one more question. The information that's shared with the mental health provider, is that permissible in court?
How do you mean? Like if the officer told a counselor or something?
Correct.
Generally not admissible in court. That would fall under the doctor-patient privilege. There are some very minor exceptions to that doctor-patient privilege, but generally if an officer talks to a doctor or a therapist, the officer has the same rights that you and I would. So if you talk to your doctor or I talk to mine, generally that's not admissible in court, but there are some exceptions. Okay, let's see now. Video evidence. I wanted to just talk with you about this because what we're seeing in our society, and I think there's some good parts to this and some challenges to this. People want to know everything now. They don't want to wait. There's a shooting, the police are involved, and then you get some people that immediately jump to one side or the other. You know, the police were justified or the police were not justified. And the reality is, you know, very few people know all the details. And so there's a real strong desire for people to say, release the video evidence so that the public can see. So BWC stands for body worn camera. And as the body worn cameras are becoming more common in Washington County, in fact, Washington County, I am an educated guess here. I think Washington County might have more body-worn cameras in the county than the entire state does combined. We have almost 600 body-worn cameras that are deployed out in the county now. It's about doubled here in the last year as a number of the agencies are deploying those body-worn cameras. So the sheriff's office is deploying those to all of their patrol deputies. Tigard is deploying those to all of their patrol deputies. King City, they're kind of catching up to where Sherwood has been because Sherwood's had them for a number of years. But as that becomes more common, people usually say, well, I want to see that footage. So we don't have a rule about always releasing the footage right away because remember, generally we wait to release information until we know what we're dealing with. We do try and balance several factors. So we're trying to balance the public has a right to know because these are things that happen in our public sphere with public servants. So the public needs to know. The investigation, we need to maintain the integrity of that investigation. So sometimes we don't want to release something until we've interviewed all the witnesses, or if we decide to present the case to the grand jury, we may not want to release something until we've had the opportunity to question witnesses under oath in front of the grand jury. Or if we know that there's a possibility we could file charges in either the officer use of force case or in the underlying case that the officer was there for in the first place, the domestic violence case that I mentioned earlier, we may not want to release everything to the public because we don't want to taint the minds of the eventual jurors who will hear that case, the 12 men and women who will be on the trial jury down the road. So we have to balance the integrity investigation. And then there's also the privacy of the people involved. Sometimes you have very violent things that are occurring, very traumatic things on camera. And so if we did release something, we would need to make appropriate redactions so that you don't have some of these things that are on the internet, because once they're there forever, of course. So I wanted just to mention that balancing act that we try and make in terms of what we release. Okay, so I didn't know how much time this would all take. And I have more on my presentation about the office, but it's 8:15 now, and that's kind of the end of my conversation about use of force. So I'm just going to maybe pause and see if people have questions. And, I don't know if you guys want me to keep going, I can, but my guess is I've talked at you and with you for a long time now, and I'm happy to come back on other occasions if you want to hear about other issues, but please feel free to ask me any questions you might have.
This was really helpful. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So Kevin, I'm not gonna ask a question, but I'm gonna kind of lead you and us and the board into maybe a little bit deeper on that last part of that conversation. One of the challenges we have, and we have seen this play out recently in other places in the news, if you've been watching, it played out to some extent, well, not to I think to a great extent, in the Tigard incident you mentioned, but also in other places. It hasn't played out in Sherwood, thankfully, but it's this balancing act between releasing information and letting our community know what's going on, and balancing that with the community's equally strong desire to make sure that we get to the bottom of this, right? And that's what becomes so conflicting is we have these two desires that are coming from our community. We have the interest by the citizens that say, hey, we want to know what happened. Like, we want to get to the bottom of this. Were the actions of the officers justified? What led to this? This needs to be investigated thoroughly, fairly, and completely. And then almost sometimes after a breath, the community will say, and we want to know right now. We want to see the camera. We want to see, and those are conflicting desires. So play with that, tease that out a little bit more for the board, because I think from my perspective as a chief, that's where a real challenge comes in. And Kevin and I have discussed this multiple times. I would dare say we've maybe even locked horns in a very friendly way a couple times about, listen, you guys can't be tight-lipped. We got to let folks know what's going on. And so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I think the first place I'd start is both of those desires are legitimate. And I think it's important to recognize that it's legitimate to have both of those things existing and coexisting. The second thing is, we have a system that's set up, and sometimes I think government can rely on systems, and there's an over-reliance on, well, this is how we do it, and we're not going to adjust. And I think if we've learned anything in the last couple of years, that's not always a good rationale for how we do things, and we need to adjust, especially as our society has different levels of expectations and evolving levels of expectations. So I would say this. 50 years ago, if we were having this Zoom conversation 50 years ago, or maybe 25 years ago, you would find that police departments, DA's offices were more opaque, less transparent, less ability to see what's happening behind the scenes. And so we're moving, I think, in a direction, and have been, of increasing that level of transparency. There is sometimes a push and a pull. So, I've gotten many calls from many police chiefs or mayors or both who have said, we need to get more information out now. And sometimes I've said, we need to make sure this investigation is done correctly before we get that information out, because it could impact the way we do an investigation. I'll give you an example. Remember I said earlier, an officer has a right, just like you and I do, to remain silent, not to give a statement. But we want to know from the officers what happened. It's better for the investigation if we know. It can be as simple as, we don't even know where to look for the bullets. When we get there at night and there's a shooting, we don't know what happened sometimes. Like, where are the bullets and where is the evidence? And so we want to ask the officer, hey, where did he shoot at you and where did you shoot at him? But remember, an officer doesn't have to say anything. And so there's a little bit of, like, think of it like pushing a string. If you push too hard, it doesn't go anywhere. If you don't push hard enough, it doesn't go anywhere. So what we have in Washington County is we have an agreement. The officers will, generally speaking, they'll do what's called a walkthrough at the scene. They'll let us know where the bullets are. They'll let us know kind of what happened where, so we can do our investigation. Then they'll step away and they get to talk to their lawyer. We'll collect all the evidence and do that investigation I talked about. And then we'll come to them and we'll do an interview to find out from them what happened. Now, if we, ahead of that interview, let's say, release all the footage from the body-worn camera, that could impact their decision whether they agree to do an interview. It could also impact their perception of what happened, because they can watch the news just like the rest of us. And sometimes we may not want the officer to watch the body-worn camera footage before we interview them. So if an officer, let's say there's 3 officers at the scene and they're all from 3 different perspectives, we may not want the officer who did the shooting to watch camera from somebody else who's, let's say, across the hallway or across the roadway and has a different perspective, because we want to know what's in that officer's mind, not what did he or she see on somebody else's camera. So there's lots of factors at play in terms of what we release and when. We want to make sure that we don't just release one piece of the puzzle. So remember I said earlier, it's like a painting that has lots of different paint colors or paintbrushes to it. Body-worn camera is a piece of that puzzle, but it's not the only piece. And if we release one but not the others, it can actually sometimes create a distorted view. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. About a year and a half ago, there was an incident in Hillsborough where there was an officer-involved shooting, and the officer shot a man in the back. And the video camera showed the officer shooting a man in the back as the man was running away. Now, if I just tell you that, I mean, I don't have the camera footage to show you right now, but that doesn't sound good, right? I think we can all agree that sounds bad. Let me paint the rest of the picture for you that the body-worn camera did not paint. The man that was shot in the back, he actually had followed another man on I-5 all the way from state of Washington through I-5, following him and harassing him on the road all the way to Hillsborough. The man who was followed was a Hispanic gentleman who was feeling terrorized by this kind of road rage guy behind him who's following him. And the Hispanic gentleman, when he got to Hillsborough and this guy's still following him, instead of pulling into his driveway, he pulls into the Hillsborough Police Department because he thinks, I'm going to get help at the Hillsborough Police Department. And when he's there at the Hillsborough Police Department, he actually goes to find a police officer. A police officer happens to just walk out the door right as this man's coming up saying, I need help, and sees the scene in front of him, and then sees these two men are kind of arguing with each other. The man who ended up getting shot in the back had a gun and was using the gun and trying to go after the other gentleman who was trying to get help. And the Hillsborough officer ended up shooting the man with the gun in the back as the man with the gun was going to injure the Hispanic gentleman that he had been following. So the Hillsborough officer saved another man's life by doing what he did. It was the only option he had to stop a murder from occurring. But the body-worn camera didn't show all of that other detail that I just explained to you. So it's just an example to contextualize how sometimes, releasing more right away doesn't create an accurate picture. And it can actually create some misperceptions. So the goal is to be accurate and to be transparent and to get it out as soon as we can, but to find that balance that I mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Kevin. And obviously, board, I think it's obvious, but this is important, and this is why I wanted to have this opportunity, because hopefully, we don't have an incident like this, but if we do, you all are going to be perfectly positioned to talk to friends and neighbors, to interact on Facebook and say, hey, listen, we've got to let the process play out. We have to give this time. You can't expect answers, 18 hours after something happens, so on and so forth. Kevin and I both have been involved in what you would call a classic homicide or a murder case, right? Those investigations can take weeks and months from start to finish till you get all the pieces together. And that's when, a life is lost. Why would we want to do it any quicker or less professional if it involved a police officer than if it didn't? So that's just another way to look at that. These investigations have to be done completely thoroughly and professionally. And, we're not going to release key details about a murder investigation before it's over. And we certainly wouldn't treat an officer-involved shooting investigation that way. So, again, this is a lot of stuff. I hope people watch this. Please, this would be another great meeting to get your friends to go and watch the recording, because this is important information for folks to have out there. So another chance for any other questions. And if not,
well, let me just say, I also answer questions at the soccer field or the basketball courts or the softball fields. That's where I'm going to be any given weekend. So, if you run into me, don't hesitate to say hi. And I am always happy to answer questions. And this is my town too. And Jeff's my favorite chief.
You have that in common with everybody else on this Zoom call, Teams call.
Well, Kevin, Barton,
all right. Thank you, Kevin. Brian, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Chief. And thank you again, Kevin, for coming. And this is definitely going to be some information that we will want to broadcast and invite people to watch when they have questions, or if they're making claims, this would be a great broadcast to help educate them about the process. So this is one for the books for sure. Next on the agenda is traffic safety update. We are short on time, but is there anything that you want to touch on regarding the traffic safety committee?
Not really. Last month we were supposed to meet, but there was not a quorum, so there was no meeting.
All right. Well, we will go on to counselor news, and I don't know if we have given the counselor who has stepped in for Kim his proper dues, but Counselor Garland, are you here?
I am here. Yeah, no worries there at all. Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, thanks. I know some of you I don't know. My name is Sean Garland. I'm a city councilor here in Sherwood. Used to actually be on the police advisory board for about 2 years. That's how I got my start in city politics. So really glad to be back here helping out. I don't know how in-depth Kim normally goes, but I think, the big news, if you haven't heard already, of course, is that we've got a new city manager signed and starting on October 7th. His name is Keith Campbell. So we're trying to come up with nicknames between Keith Campbell and Mayor Keith Mays, because it's going to be too confusing having two Keiths in the room at most times. So the going thing right now is that they're going to arm wrestle for it, and then whoever wins gets to choose the other person's nickname. So we'll see how that goes. He's coming to us from Staten, Oregon, so he's actually very local. Actually, I think he has some familiarity with some of our folks that are actually with our police department as well, which is nice, and in a good way. I shouldn't set you guys up for any assumptions that he knows our police department in any kind of negative possible ways. And so he's starting October 7th. Kristen Schweitzer has been our interim city manager, has done a fantastic job. She will presumably slide back into the role that she's had up to this point. So I'm sure you all have an opportunity to meet with him if you'd like to. He's going to be very open. He's going to move his family here to Sherwood as well. He's very excited to do that. So that's great. Other than that, we've got some meetings coming up. We're meeting on Tuesday, the 21st. It's quite honestly kind of a boring agenda, so I'm not going to touch too much on that. But October 5th, we have a couple work sessions prior to our council meeting, which may be of some interest to some of you. We're bringing back the subject of backyard chickens, which is something that came up, I think it was around 2014 that a previous council dealt with that question. And we've had some citizens that have raised the question again. So we're going to just have a work session to talk about it, see if it's anything that the council wants to pursue, or if we want to just leave it as is. So we'll talk about that on Tuesday, October 5th, as well as have some further conversations about the Sherwood Alfresco programs, the outdoor dining program that was on Railroad Street during the pandemic. It was very popular and very successful. It was implemented, of course, to assist those businesses, specifically some of those restaurants down there on in Old Town on Railroad Street that are smaller in size, and due to the indoor dining capacity requirements that came during the pandemic, they really were going to be impacted very negatively by the spacing guidelines of that. So our previous city manager, Joe Gall, and some of our other folks did some great work to very quickly create this outdoor dining program. Big success with everybody. But in April, I believe it was, we kind of made the decision with the numbers coming down, things looking better, that we were eventually going to end this temporary program. I think it ended finally in July. And so, but we had a lot of people that asked us to continue this program or look at other ways to make it either recurring annual event or even a permanent type of thing. So all of those ideas are on the table. We're going to talk about that in a work session as well coming up in October. And we're hopefully going to make some progress as well between now and October on some more design work on the proposed pedestrian bridge going across the 99W near the new high school. So it's some work that we've been doing, been working a lot of different fronts on that for securing funding, and we're pretty good there at this point. And then we will be looking at designs, working with a couple of groups to get the designs for a bridge, see what it looks like, and trying to do it in the most cost-effective way. So that's coming up as well. So I will stop there, see if anybody has any questions for me at all, city council related or other.
I would just say, after hearing tonight's comments, maybe we can make that bridge a little wider for all the traffic coming down Sunset, just to continue right on over.
Just drive the cars right up on there. Yeah, it has to be an ADA bridge, so we're just kind of do a little switchback thing if they can pull it off. Motorcycles for sure, but although Chief might have a problem with motorcycles on a pedestrian bridge, but Yeah, hopefully, it's everybody wants it. Everybody's very concerned. Chief is probably the top of the list of people, pedestrians crossing at that intersection. It's just really not a optimal place for crossing. So we're going to move as quickly as we can on that bridge. But as with anything, it's going to take a little bit of time, but we'll get there.
Hey, Sean, given that it's going to take forever to get this bridge in, do we have an idea of when forever will end? Like class of 31, class of 27, class of 25?
We're thinking a couple years, probably a couple years at the most. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that we've been looking at is working with some companies that do almost kind of a prefab type of bridge. And so there may be some options to really cut some time doing that. So we will see.
Well, thank you again for joining with us, and we are going to move on real quickly to staff reports. Any staff reports anyone wants to speak to?
Yeah, so I covered most of that traffic stuff. I will just add to Councilor Garland's announcement. So as of right now, I think Mr. Campbell, our new city manager, is planning to join you at your October meeting. On the 21st. So yeah, that'll be awesome. So, and then just a quick hiring update. As you know, we have 3 positions we need to fill. And unfortunately, we completely exhausted our recruit list, which is not the first time that we have done that. That's the bad news. The good news is, though, we have 3 lateral candidates in the queue. So those are folks that either are or recently were police officers. And they are all 3 fairly strong candidates. So we're moving forward with them, and they will not need to go to the police academy, except one of them potentially, since he's from out of state, may have to go to a 2-week shortened thing, but that's easy. So we're very excited about that. And so more to come on that, but so far so good. So, and that's all I've got.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Do we have any citizen comments this evening, Angie?
No, we didn't receive any.
All right. Well, if there are no objections, we will now adjourn the meeting. Any objections? Hearing none, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all for your time. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Councilor Garland, for joining us. Thank you all.